This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Tonight we apply our patent-pending Stanley rubric to the third movie in our month of Alfred Hitchcock, Shadow of a Doubt, starring Joseph Cotten and Teresa Wright. However, quickly before we get to the show, next week we are continuing our month of Alfred Hitchcock with our last entry for the year and our Halloween episode, Psycho, starring Anthony Perkins, Janet Leigh, Vera Miles, and Martin Balsam. You won't want to miss that one, so please watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOOD. Also, you can still sign up for our weekly newsletter either by the website in the show notes, you can subscribe at the bottom of every page, or you can email us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Additionally, did you know that our website has the full notes of every episode of the show, as well as the master list of movies we've graded so far? There are links in the episode descriptions of every episode to direct you right there. Check them out. And, as always, please like, follow, rate, and review the show on whichever podcast platform you use. We'd really appreciate it. With that, Dad, this is our third Alfred Hitchcock movie of the month that we've discussed on the show so far. But this is our first regular episode back in like 5 weeks. How are we doing?
I was doing real well until I had to go back to work, and then the proverbial pie hit the fan.
I'm not sure that's the usual word for that metaphor.
Oh, it isn't? Oh, okay.
I mean, this is an explicit podcast, and we have not been shy about our language use at times, but interesting to withhold on that particular term at that point in time. I know, it's kind of slow rolling once you get back into things, so I don't know. I'm a little wary of this episode since we haven't done one in a while, and we had so many pre-recorded, and we were doing so many during the summer that I thought we got into a rhythm, and now I just don't know what's going to happen with this particular episode, but I guess we'll see. I'm also a little bit concerned because I have to say, as far as certain Alfred Hitchcock movies go, this is kind of a middle one for me. And just on quality. I know we're going to get to the greatness score and all of the factors that go into it later, but this is one where I just don't have a strong opinion one way or the other as to the quality of the movie. It was fine. Is it one of his great ones? Probably not. It's maybe in the upper half as far as I'm concerned, but I just didn't buy parts of it as much as I have some of his other films.
Well, I every time I see it, I just see what a great piece of craftsmanship it was. I mean, it was well done. And, this is a rather novel concept, the serial killer. And it really, in a genre that didn't really exist that much before this, the crazed killer. And I don't know, I thought it's while it's not one of his most famous, I think this is done as well as a lot of his films.
I think it's a well-executed film in many respects. I think that the direction was fine. I think he's much more skilled as an artisan when we get to some of his 50s work. This is still some of it, what of his transition period between a lot of his earlier British movies and then what he did in the States later on. But I just don't see some of the same flares. You can see them occasionally. Like when we were watching this together over the weekend, there was a couple of times that I just paused, and particularly at one scene I'm sure we're going to get to, or at least one moment, that I just sat back and just kind of marveled at. But it still doesn't have quite the same care for it in the way that you get from a Rear Window or a Vertigo or North by Northwest, a Psycho. Just some of the ones that he was a little bit further along in his craftsmanship by comparison to this. And outside of the two main actors, Teresa Wright and Joseph Cotten, I thought that most of the rest of the cast was kind of just there. Like they weren't doing a whole lot. I don't know if that has more to do with the directorship or the writing or how everything went about, but really this was a somewhat of a stage play between two actors, and then everybody else was just kind of there to support them.
Yes. There's only one actor out of the supporting cast that I think really kind of stood out, and we'll get to that later on. But
So this was my first time watching this film. I didn't have any prior relationship to it. So what, if any, relationship did you have to this movie going in?
it's one that was always on my list, but I never could find it either on streaming or Turner or whatever. I got a gift of some of the collected works of Hitchcock, and I watched it. This was the third time I've seen it, and I gain an appreciation every time I watch it. So I think I probably didn't watch it for the first time until maybe about 10 years ago.
It is an interesting first watch. I would probably have to watch it again because I think there are things of this that I missed, at least some of the back half of plot points. I think I missed some pretty significant moments, but I don't know. It's hard for me to have much of a strong opinion one way or the other, and those are the hardest movies to review. With that, we have a lot packed into this episode because it's our first one back. So let's kind of move things along quickly. Do you have your plot summary ready for us?
I do. Uncle Charlie Oakley, Joseph Cotten, lives alone in a rooming house. Two men come looking for him, so he decides to leave town and go to Santa Rosa, California to see his sister and her family. Young Charlie Newton, Teresa Wright, is named for her uncle and worships him. Two men soon appear at the Newton home posing as interviewers working on a national survey. Uncle Charlie becomes upset and berates his sister for opening up her home to strangers. The young interviewer, Jack Graham, McDonald Carey, who is interested in Charlie romantically, soon tells her that her uncle is one of two suspects who may be the Merry Widow murderer. Young Charlie undertakes her own investigation, but a series of potentially life ending accidents occur as she races to protect her family.
Thank you. Cast for this movie: Teresa Wright as Charlotte Charlie Newton, Joseph Cotten as Charles Uncle Charlie Oakley, McDonald Carey as Detective Jack Graham, Henry Travers as Joseph Newton, Patricia Collinge as Emma Newton, Wallace Ford as Detective Fred Saunders, Hume Cronin as Herbie Hawkins, Edna Mae Wanacott as Ann Newton, Charles Bates as Roger Newton, Janet Shaw as Louise Finch, Estelle Jewell as Catherine. Recognition for this film: the film was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Story for Gordon MacDonald. In 1991, the film was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress, being deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The film was also Alfred Hitchcock's favorite of all of his films. In a 1964 interview on Telescope with host Fletcher Markle, Markle noted, "Mr. Hitchcock, most critics have always considered Shadow of a Doubt, which you made in 1943, as your finest film." Hitchcock replied immediately, "Me too." Markle then asked, "That is your opinion of it still?" Hitchcock replied, "Oh, no question." At the time, Hitchcock's most recent work was Marnie. When later interviewed by Francois Truffaut, Hitchcock denied the suggestion that Shadow of a Doubt was his favorite. But in the audio interview with Truffaut, Hitchcock confirmed it was his favorite film and later reiterated that Shadow of a Doubt was his favorite film in his interview with Mike Douglas in 1969 and in his interview with Dick Cavett in 1972. Did you know? In his interview with Francois Truffaut on Shadow, first published in 1967, Alfred Hitchcock said the dense black smoke belching from the train that brings Charles Oakley to Santa Rosa was a deliberate symbol of imminent evil. Did you know? Alfred Hitchcock said that part of why he considered this to be his favorite movie was that he loved the idea of bringing menace to an otherwise idyllic small town. Did you know? In a 1959 interview, Teresa Wright said that this was her favorite movie. Did you know? Alfred Hitchcock wanted William Powell to play Uncle Charlie, but MGM refused to loan him out, so the role went to Joseph Cotten. Did you know? Alfred Hitchcock had wanted either Joan Fontaine or Olivia de Havilland for the role of young Charlie, but they were unavailable. Did you know? Charlie's sister mentions that he'd had an accident on a bicycle when he was a boy. Earl Nelson, the serial killer on whom this story is loosely based, suffered from extremely serious mental illness, which, along with his history of occipital headaches, was attributed to a near fatal bicycle accident in his childhood in which he was seriously struck on the back of the head. Charlie's sister mentions how his personality had changed after the accident, getting into mischief, which is what happened with Nelson, who soon began to commit burglaries. Did you know? Before leaving for the West Coast, Charlie leaves his room and turns to follow his landlady. It is inferred that she would never be seen again. The real life serial killer Earl Nelson, whose activities inspired this film, had a penchant for killing landladies and molesting them afterwards. Did you know? A box office failure when it was released, the box office rank was number 81 for that year. Did you know? The $40,000 in 1943 that Charlie opened the bank account with would be the equivalent of $606,000 in 2020. All right, Dad, so what would be the elevator pitch for this movie?
Evil comes to a small town.
You never know what dark secrets endure, even in your own family.
Oh, I know what dark secrets endure in my own family.
Oh, do you now?
Yes, not my immediate family, but the extended family, yes. All you need to do is type the last name into the to CCAP with the criminal access code through the state of Wisconsin court system, and you'll find him.
A few of them, yes.
Yeah.
So, best performer for you?
Joseph Cotten. I thought Joseph Cotten's part in this was great. He could go from being the happy-go-lucky uncle to being just a menace. You could just see the dark side flip. He played the sociopath who has that ability to just turn on personality and turn it off as well as you could. I thought he was such a great actor, and I think this was one of the better parts he did.
I've liked Joseph Cotten for a lot of things. I really loved him in The Third Man. I think he's actually one of the better performers in Citizen Kane as well. It's why I was a little bit excited to see this film because I don't think they ever had another pairing, Alfred Hitchcock and Joseph Cotten, as far as I can recall.
No,
So I would agree with you. I ended up with him as my best performer as well. And I think part of that has to do with I don't know what the precedent was going into this for what we deemed serial killers or the fervor around it. It certainly was not the level to which we have the interest today with a lot of true crime and the obsession, the amount of podcasts, documentaries, movies basically about true crime. That being said, he does almost give the blueprint for how to play this character. You mentioned that before, and I would definitely agree. There is a sense that this guy just has this underneath darkness that is always there, and that's his true side. And it's almost a ruthless aggression when it needs to be, but he can also flip that switch to be these sweet, nice guy that can fool everybody. And you see that a lot with a lot of serial killer shows or movies that this just seems to be the personality type. So for him to be capable of doing that and knowing how to play that, either it's a testament to the writing, the directing, or the acting. And I would guess it's more than likely the directing and the acting.
I think so too. I don't know how in that time frame he understood what this dark menace was, this sociopath personality we've all come to know. I mean, all you have to do is just put his performance up against some of the interviews you've seen of Ted Bundy, and you'll see the charm, the attractiveness, the warm smile, the self-effacement, the ability to be endearing, and then it snaps and it's complete opposite without a moment's notice.
I'm really not sure how to say it. A savageness that you can just see in their eyes, and he plays it so beautifully well in this movie. There's one scene in particular that I'm going to mention a bunch of times, but it's that dinner table scene where he's describing the old widows, and it's just magnificent from the quote to the scene to the moment. I sat back. I literally paused it when we saw it, and I'm like, holy shit. Because of the way it was framed, the way it was acted, it was just so magnificent. I think that scene arguably would be up there with any that Hitchcock did throughout the course of his films. I mean, it was a spectacular scene.
Yeah, I had memorized some of those lines of years ago, and actually sitting on a cruise ship with your mother having dinner, I just started reading those lines, and she was like looking at me like I'm insane. But I mean, it just
Well,
seemed to
you
fit.
are.
Well, yeah, but it just seemed to fit.
That seemed to fit on a cruise ship eating dinner with my mother.
Well, I'm looking around and seeing all those fat, silly wives. Uh,
You are
is it?
insane.
Well,
You
yeah.
you are insane.
Any more than saying I was practicing tiny bubbles for the karaoke on the ship?
That thing went on for like at least 12 months, if not 18 afterward, where you just randomly kept singing tiny bubbles.
Yeah. Sometimes the joke is that the joke becomes so stale that and people overreact to it.
Yeah, okay. Except
Eh,
that you've done that so many times. Anyway, best secondary performer for you.
Teresa Wright. She made very few films in her career, and but each one she did, she just seemed like she was so good in it. It kind of is sad that she was one of the first to really try to break the glass ceiling. She got into a pissing match with the studio over the fact that her films were drawing as much box office as some of the leading men, and she was getting paid half. And so she said, I expect to be paid more. They said no. So she says, I'm done. So she walked out. They said, you'll be back. You'll be back. No, she wasn't. She just happened to marry a young insurance company executive who ended up becoming the president of one of the major insurance companies in the country. And she became the party host and social activity director for him and spent the rest of her life doing that.
Yeah, I have liked her in just about everything we've seen. We covered one of her movies earlier on in the show, our episode on the best years of our lives. And if you haven't listened to that one, I would suggest going back to listening to it because I think it's still comfortably inside our top 10, if not our top five on the overall list. But she just has this great ability to play innocent and earnest in everything she does. And they usually do such a great job of casting her to play such roles that require that level of honesty from its female subject, but she never seems completely out of place. She just feels like a kid who is struggling to understand the world in which she's living in and come to grips with the adolescence that is being thrust upon her at every single moment. And that happens whether it's in Mrs. Miniver or it's this movie or the best years of our lives. It's her always coming to terms with the world around her.
Yeah, she does have that quality. It's a certain naivete, but it's not huckster in quality. I mean, you believe her as she's struggling to mature.
I'm trying to think of who would be a good comp to what she is now. Going back to when she won her Oscar, maybe Jennifer Lawrence, but she's done so many other things at this point that I wouldn't say that that's a like for like.
I think the early movies that Jennifer Lawrence did would be fairly
Right. The ones that she
compatible.
was doing with David O. Russell maybe would be
Yeah,
closer. I just can't think of anybody else that has this level of. Oh, you know what? I'll say this much. Saoirse Ronan is very much a similar actress. She's thrust into a lot of coming of age roles. She's kind of coming to grips with adolescence and the world that's being thrust upon her, but does it in such a certain grace that it's kind of similar. I think they're different actors or excuse me, actresses, but I could see similar roles being played by both of them.
sure.
All right, I almost went with Alfred Hitchcock as my best secondary performer only because I knew I had Teresa Wright as my most charismatic. Again, she's just brilliant in everything that she does, and it's really hard to pick against her as the most charismatic. But I think almost there should be something said about his direction and figuring it out, and some of the imagery that's available in this. He still does a good job of framing shots, but it's not quite to the expertise level that I mentioned.
Well, I have Hitchcock as best or as most charismatic because of that. I mean, you can see where he's going. You can watch this film and you know how he got to be where he was in the 50s and how he became such an icon. And
Okay, how do
in
you
pop,
extend this into charisma?
because he became through the films in Hitchcock became simultaneous. He became the master of suspense. And it's in these films, and it's, I think to some extent this one specifically, because he was coming a few years earlier off of Rebecca, where he had it won Best Film. I think he became one of the first real celebrity directors that people went to see his films because he directed it. You know, people knew who John Ford was, and they knew who George Cukor was, and all this. But it came down to, hey, Hitchcock has a new film, and it was more about Hitchcock and what he was going to do with the film than the film itself.
All right, I guess I can buy it.
But I'm gonna give a small shout out to a guy who went on to have a very long and successful career, and that's Hume Cronin. He became a collaborator with Hitchcock throughout the 40s and early 50s. Did a lot of writing, wrote several of the scripts, some various versions. In fact, Hume Cronin worked on a film for a number of years that they kind of put aside and then brought back, that Hitchcock had as a working title, Inside Lincoln's Nose.
I didn't put it in our "Did you know" section, but this is actually his film debut.
Yeah, and this really set it up because he then after this did Lifeboat, and then like I said, he did a lot of screenwriting with Hitchcock, and he and his wife, who was Jessica Tandy, who was Miss Daisy and Driving Miss Daisy, became friends of the Hitchcocks. Spent a lot of times at their house in San Francisco, and they did a lot of writing together and a lot of stuff, and it kind of built a collaboration over a number of years.
Anyway, let's go to best scene then. I have a few down here. Let me know if I miss any. Uncle Charlie arrives. Graham confesses to young Charlie. The library, elderly widows, which is somewhat of a code name. I didn't really know how else to describe that moment. The stairs, the garage, and the train.
Yes.
Any did I miss?
I think the boarding house, or at the very beginning, set the stage as to his character and what that there was something not right about him.
Yes, but I just don't find that there was a ton going on. That seems to be a lot of exposition. And while it's not exposition for the sake of exposition, where there's just a conversation going on, I just didn't find, other than it was set up, that it added a lot to the film outside of some of the other scenes. I think the other ones really have an explanation for the revolving action of the movie by comparison to that scene.
Well, I think if you look at that scene, one thing that struck me this time watching it, he's completely dressed. He is in a suit, tie. Everything about him is well preserved and he's well put together. So the facade is there, but you get an inner view as to his psychology, that he's tortured internally and he sees that the end is near, he's going to get caught, and he's trying to figure a way out. But yet the facade remains.
Part of the other reason that I didn't have it down was is it's kind of a confusing scene because two men come by, they're clearly standing outside. You don't understand. I guess it's supposed to be gleaned that they don't know what he looks like because he can just pass right by them. But I didn't understand that until much later in the film by some other stuff that was going on. And basically the exposition, I don't like to have my picture taken, that you start to glean that, okay, I guess they don't know what he looks like. But then that sets up other bigger plot holes in this, such as why are a couple of local cops following him from New York all the way to California? And what kind of budget do they have in 1943?
Yeah,
Also, how
okay.
can you follow a guy out to California that you don't know what he looks like? It just doesn't make any sense to me. But anyway, out of the scenes that we've talked about here, what would you say is the best scene?
Oh, the dinner scene where he starts talking about this fat, silly
Elderly
wives.
widows.
Yeah. I mean, that scene is just phenomenal.
It would be hard for me to nominate just about anything else. I would say that, like every other Alfred Hitchcock movie, it does have a big ending sequence on the train that I think is somewhat memorable. But outside of that, I think that moment by far is the scene that you would point back to immediately if you suggested this to anybody, where this is the first, second time that they've seen it.
I think that's exactly the case. I mean, it, and it's also, most indelible to me. It's the scene I always remember. It's the monotone, the anger, the bitterness in his voice that he just keeps going on. And
It's like
the
a
thing,
contempt or a disgust.
yeah, and the thing that's really striking this third time that I've seen it is that only Charlie is upset by these comments. The rest of the family acts like they don't even notice.
Well, it's one of the few times that he lets his facade actually slip. That's his true self finally coming out.
Yes.
And it's weird for him to just let his guard down like that, except to give us a great cinematic moment. So, is that your favorite scene as well?
Yes.
I know you already had nominated for most indelible. I would say that the train, though, it does set up a good ending, and it's a lot lower stakes than running around on the Mount Rushmore or hanging off the Statue of Liberty. But it still has enough stakes that there's a death that I could certainly get behind that being somewhat indelible as well. I just don't think it's quite as much as the first time that I saw that, and it just bowled me over the dinner scene. So let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back with our long list, unfortunately, of in memoriam. Thank you for rejoining us, Dad. So we have not done this in about 5 weeks. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of people in the industry during that time. Who do we have that we need to remember?
Well, he wasn't really an actor per se, but I put him on the list anyway. September 4th, we lost Willard Scott, who was the longtime weatherman on the Today Show. But before that, as a child, he was the original Ronald McDonald on television.
Oh,
And so I'm putting him on because that character is an American icon. September 6th, we lost Michael K. Williams, who was in The Wife, Boardwalk Empire, 12 Years a Slave. Also that
um,
day,
I don't think he was in The Wife. His most famous role was The Wire.
oh, well, that's what I had. Well, maybe I typed wrong. I'll
Yeah,
repeat that.
so The
I'll
Wife
go
is a
back.
good movie, and that should be watched by itself. But I'm pretty sure this was meant to be The Wire because that's
Yes,
his most famous and iconic role as Omar from that show.
yes. All right. Anthony Johnson, who was in House Party, Friday, and Menace 2 Society. The September 8th, Art Matrano, an actor, was in Police Academy. They Don't Shoot Horses, and Joni Loves Chachi.
I think the title I have here is They Shoot Horses, Don't They?
Yeah, I'm vaguely familiar with the film.
I'm much more familiar with the names Police Academy and Joni Loves Chachi, even if I've never seen either.
Yes. Fran Bennett, who was in Nightingales and Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Don Collier, who was in The Outlaws, The High Chaparral, and The Young Riders. Jane Powell, an actress who was in Seven Brides for Seven Brothers and Royal Wedding. Julie Reed, Why Must I Die and
Is it
Tormented.
Julie Reed or is it Julie Redding?
Excuse me, Julie Redding, who was in Why Must I Die and The Tormented. Basil Hoffman, who was in The Artist, also on Hill Street Blues and Santa Barbara, which were TV shows. Willie Garson, who was in the Sex and the City TV show and then also made the transition over to the movies. White Collar, and John from Cincinnati, passed of pancreatic cancer, unfortunately, at 57. He was a great follow on Twitter. Cynthia Harris, who was Mad About You, Edward and Mrs. Simpson, and Three Men and a Baby. Gerald Holm, who was in Return of the Jedi and London Boulevard. Granville Adams, an American actor, was in Oz, Homicide, Life on the Street, and Empire. Ricardo Flanagan, 40 years old, young guy, American comedian and actor who was in Shameless and Walk the Prank. And this one I saved for last, Ruthie Thompson, an American animator. She was worked on Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Dumbo. She was 111 years old.
Yeah, she worked on stuff I think as far back as like Snow White, and as well as I think all the way up to like the 80s with like the Rescuers Down Under. I was
Yeah,
looking at that the other day. By the way, I do want to make a name correction. It's Ricardo Flanagan.
excuse me, yes.
So out of these, the ones that I personally remember or have a relationship with, Michael K. Williams, because I'd watched a couple of seasons of The Wire, but I most knew him for certain roles, like in Boardwalk Empire. I had watched most of that show. He's just always been a great and menacing character that was capable of playing really hard characters, but with a soul. You could always tell the humanity in these characters that were supposed to be almost lowlifes, but that needed extra depth. I think one of his best performances, and he had just been nominated for an Emmy with his work in Lovecraft Country, but one of the best performances I thought he gave was The Night of, the miniseries from a couple of years ago. If you haven't seen that on HBO, I think it's about 6, 7 episodes, but it's a really, really good series. And he plays somebody that's incarcerated along with Riz Ahmed's character, and they kind of become friends. He's kind of the guy who runs the cell block. It's a really great performance. The other one for me that I at least had a relationship with was Willie Garson, just due to watching, sparsely a little bit. I tried to get into Sex in the City because, it was one of those series that everybody talked about. So I thought, okay, we'll give it a try. I think I got through like 1.5 seasons. But anyway, the big one for me with him was always White Collar. And to see that a guy that was kind of a fun, easily likable character to die of pancreatic cancer in his mid to late 50s. I mean, that's just as sad as you could possibly get.
Yeah, he and I were the same age, so yeah, it was sad. And like I said, I have been a follower of his on Twitter. He always had some real good comments. Was a very likable guy. He leaves behind an adopted son who's in college and film school, actually, in Ohio. It's sad to lose people, although Ruthie Thompson, that's amazing.
Yeah.
111.
I mean, I
So,
think we threw a huge party. What was it? The guy from Saboteur who had lived to 101.
yes.
I want to say his last name starts with an L. Norman Lloyd.
Yes.
But regardless, obviously, we appreciate all of these people for the fine work that they did during their lives and their careers, and we honor them here with a moment of silence. Thank you. All right, let's move to best funniest lines. I doubt that you're going to have too many funny lines from this movie,
No.
but what are some of the best ones that you picked out?
Well, there's the big line, which is the cities are full of women, or middle aged widows, husbands, dead,
If you're gonna
husbands.
do it, you got to deliver it.
All right, I'll do it. The cities are full of women, middle aged widows, husbands, dead husbands who have spent their lives making fortunes, working and working, and then they die and leave their money to their wives, their silly wives. And what do the wives do? These useless women? You see them in the hotels, the best hotels, every day by the thousands, drinking the money, eating the money, losing the money at bridge, playing all day and all night, smelling of money, proud of their jewels, but of nothing else. Horrible, faded, fat, greedy women.
But they're alive. They're human beings.
Are they?
Yeah, and that's what to me is the signifier. It was that last punch. One I had picked up. You think you know something, don't you? You think you're the clever little girl who knows something. There's so much you don't know. So much. What do you know, really? You're just an ordinary little girl living in an ordinary little town. You wake up every morning of your life and you know perfectly well that there's nothing in the world to trouble you. You go through your ordinary little day, and at night you sleep in your untroubled, ordinary little sleep filled with peaceful, stupid dreams. And I brought you nightmares. Or did I? Or was it a silly, inexpert little lie? You live in a dream. You're a sleepwalker, blind. How do you know what the world is like? Do you know the world is a foul sty? Do you know if you rip the fronts off of houses, you'd find swine? The world's a hell. What does it matter what happens in it? Wake up, Charlie. Use your wits. Learn something. You have any others?
Actually, no. Not that it were worth quoting, I guess.
I had one other one. Charlie and Graham at the end of the movie. I'm glad you were able to come, Jack. I couldn't have faced it without someone who knew. I did know more. I couldn't tell you. I know. He thought the world was a horrible place. He couldn't have been very happy ever. He didn't trust people. He seemed to hate them. Hated the whole world. You know, he said that people like us had no idea what the world was really like. Well, it's not quite as bad as that, but sometimes it needs a lot of watching. It seems to go crazy every now and then, like your Uncle Charlie. All right, Stanley rubric time.
It is. It's been a while, so
All right, Legacy, let's start it off. What do you got down?
I went with a 6. For Hitchcock fans, it's a film that's always one of their, for the true fans, that everybody kind of knows or kind of has on the back burner or suggests watching. But I would say that 80% of the public has never heard of it.
Okay, so we normally split this category. It's Hitchcock's favorite, and I think it's known by that as people in the industry like to think of it. But again, I would agree with you that it's not one of the well known Hitchcock movies. It's kind of in the deeper archive. And it's discussed among film fans, but is this ever really like a notable Hitchcock film? I wondered and went and looked at a bunch of lists today because I'm like, how many top tens or top fives is this movie ever in? And I honestly found that just about every top 10, I think the lowest I ever saw it was 12 out of his movies. And every other one had it about 7, 8, 9. So it was inside the top 10, but it was not like one of his seven seminal achievements of his career by any stretch. And I do think that it is a film that most of the general public just is not going to know. I mean, it's not available, it's not streamed very often, it's not like one of these TCM classics you see on all the time. And
Yeah.
that's just kind of my big point. I think this is a more of an industry level thing. I think if you recognize it at all, and I'll give credit that the audience in the general public, you are going to have film fans that know of the movie. So I'll go a 3 for the industry because I think it's more known and appreciated among film fans. I'll go 1.5 for the audience, so that's a 4.5 overall. So that makes it a 5.25 average between us.
Okay.
All right. So then, impact significance. Do you want to start or do you want me to go?
I'll start, I guess. Again, if we're going to divide this in this particular category, the critics loved it. It was pretty much a standard critically acclaimed film. So to that extent, I'm giving it a 4.5 because of that. But the public did not appreciate it as much. It didn't have big a box office draw. It's I think the subject matter was a little heavy when the when it was released. We're in the middle of war. In 1943, things weren't necessarily going the best for the Allies, and I think to some extent people didn't want to necessarily go to something heavy when they were going out at night, and so maybe that was part of the why it was not as much of a box office draw as others. So I'm giving that aspect a 3, simply because it has had some staying power. It's not like the film was completely disappeared, or it was completely not noted or considered or thought about at the time it was released, and it did have some longevity. So therefore, I'm at an 8, or excuse me, 7.5.
Yeah, I was going to say. So I don't need to repeat all of the arguments. You basically already made all of them, but I came to very different scores. If it's the 81st film in a year, like you're talking about, I'm trying to think of what would be the 81st box office film of 2021. Something that I completely forgotten.
Anything with Pauly Shore.
Well, I don't think there is anything with Pauly Shore. That's the point. But if you're the 81st film in a year in 2020, like, or 2021, you basically have probably not made back even your budget. So, and this is in a day and age when there are tons of movies. There's probably 3 or 4 movies released every weekend between streaming now and just regular theaters. So, in 1943, to be the 81st film, there may have been 85 films released that year.
Oh, no, no. There were a lot more than that.
Well, either
Because you have to
way,
understand that they had B films going. There wasn't television. So, the Hollywood was churning out films, you
okay.
know,
All right, point taken. Regardless, I'm just going to say that yes, the universal acclaim from the critics was there, but they didn't give it a lot of awards attention because it just didn't resonate with the public. So I think they had an understanding of their audience. I ended up with a 4 with that. I'll give the audience attention a 1.5. So that ends at a 5.5 for me. This will end up as a 6.5 combined or average score between us. Novelty, I think you have a lot more to say on this one than I do. I found this one a very difficult category because I didn't really understand its place in the historical sense going in. So why don't you take a shot at it first?
I've spent pretty much the last 54, 55 years, well, 53, 54 years of my life watching films. I can't say that I ever saw a film before this one, time wise, that was about a serial killer. It was completely different. There was a psychological aspect of it. It was based on a true person. The fact that they did some explanation about how this situation may have occurred as a result of a brain injury. I mean, I just thought it was way ahead of its time. And it did foreshadow Hitchcock's interest in the murderer as a sociopath.
I guess in considering all of your points, I'd probably have to bump up where I was originally at. I didn't find there to be that much novel about it that I could just think of off the top of my head. I guess context considering serial killers and kind of basing it on true crime, although not completely, has become more of a modern thing. I think maybe I'm colored by the fact that I've essentially grown up with murder and true crime and serial killers being such a big thing. Like we go back to the Silence of the Lambs that we already did on the show, Zodiac. Basically every third David Fincher film is about some type of serial killing.
Well, we can go back to television even with Robert Stack.
Let's not. But anyway, Dexter.
Yeah. Sorry to bring up childhood traumas of
Fuck you.
unsolved mysteries.
Regardless, I don't know. I'd like to punt on this one, and I can't.
Well,
I
no,
just
there's no punting. There's no punting in the rubric.
I know. I'll give it an extra point from where I was at. I was at a 5. I'll give it a 6. What was your score again?
I hadn't given it, but I had an 8.5 for novelty.
It would be a 7.25 average between us with those. Classicness. You always go first. This is your category.
Yeah, I did not find anything that was inappropriate or cringeworthy. In fact, the heroine was the the savior in this film. Teresa Wright overcomes the physical dominance of her uncle Charlie and wins at the end. I mean, it portrays women in a very positive light. I mean, it for the most part, I thought this was a very well done movie as far as its longevity and how it portrayed, and I think it foreshadowed how people and how films dealt with serial killers and sociopaths for decades to come. So I went with a 9.
I don't know. I didn't focus on this in my score, and I rarely do. But since you often make it a part of yours, you could say that this is the archetypal damsel in distress.
Okay, but the damsel in distress won. She by herself, her little self. Teresa Wright is not a very big woman. She overcomes a guy who's almost a foot taller than her and wins, who's a sociopath. I mean, how many times have you ever seen in a 1940s film where the woman ends up becoming the winner in those scenarios?
Again, it's not part of my normal part of this category. I rarely focus on the engendered role portions of it. I usually leave that to you because you hone in on that a lot better than I do. So let me give mine. I'm not going to give this demerits based on older technology like telegrams being a significant portion of the setup of this film, or the commonplace of train travel instead of cars. Again, this is pre 50s, so highways were not nearly the thing that they became. Where I can knock this is a little bit in how the investigation is seemingly unusual, if not absurd, with cops chasing a man who they don't know what he looks like across the country, and we're supposed to believe that they're going to break protocol by infiltrating a house warrantless with the ruse of being journalists. I mean, come on. I gotta knock it at least a half point for that. However, I do give this back in its favor. The constant conversation about how Joseph and Herbie would try to kill each other, that they'd be fascinated by true crime, is incredibly noteworthy given the obsession of people trying to work out, oh, what would be the perfect murder? And how do I write a murder mystery? And how did this person get away with this? Or how is this unsolved? And the two of them being like old mother hens discussing their murder theories is so commonplace currently that it feels modern. So I'm going to put that in a point in its favor. I normally start at a 7, so we have a half point off, add a full point back, get to a 7.5.
Okay,
So that's an 8.25 between us. Rewatchability. Go ahead.
7.5. It's comfort food is my standard. And after having watched it now a third time, this is one that I'm going to put in my as your sister once said, "Qui," for a type of film that I'm going to try and watch once a year. I have several Hitchcock films that I do: Rear Window, North by Northwest, Dial M for Murder. I think this is one I'm going to put in that list. I can see myself on a day where I have it open and I don't want to think about work or think about anything else. Just popping this in, and along with a couple other Hitchcock films, and just losing myself for an afternoon or a whole day.
I similarly had this kind of in that general in between category. I don't think of it as highly as you do. This is a favorable movie to me, one I could revisit, but that I'm somewhat indifferent over. It's a likable film. There's not anything terribly dark with it. There are good enough performances and things to glean off of. It is one of the better movies of a master craftsman. So there are things to revisit at some point or another, but given that it's not as fun as some of the other ones. And while it is under 2 hours, which makes it much more easily rewatchable than some other things, this is just not one that I feel the need to constantly go back to. I ended up with a 6. So that's a 6.75 average between us. For audience score, we had an 87 for Google users. We had an 89 for Rotten Tomato users, averaging out to an 8.8 audience score. So that was 5.25 for legacy, 6.5 for impact significance, 7.25 for novelty, 8.25 for classicness, 6.75 for rewatchability, and an 8.8 for audience score, leaving us with a 42.8, and that would currently put it in between Sleepless in Seattle and Silver Linings Playbook on the list.
Okay.
Interesting movies to be compared to.
Yes.
So, what are your remaining questions, if any?
How did they explain Uncle Charlie falling off the train and getting run over by another train?
Yeah, especially with young Charlie also being on the train at the time.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of an open plot hole. Another one for me. What happens to all the money?
Well, it probably goes to the sister because she would have been next of kin.
I would guess, but there's a lot of money there.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
And how do they explain all of that?
They don't because they never looked into it.
I suppose. Especially since they basically hung the killing on the other guy.
Yep. And the other thing is he's carrying it around in cash. Can you imagine somebody walking around today carrying $600,000 in cash on their person?
Yes, but they're probably dealing something.
Yeah, okay.
Did you have any other questions?
No, I don't.
Does Emma ever find out about Uncle Charlie?
Of course not. Because it's going to be kept from her.
I think they imply that by the last line in the movie that I read for as a quote. I just can't imagine that they would, but I also don't know how they would keep it from her.
Print the legend.
Oh yes, another movie we're gonna have coming up here in early next year, I think.
Yes.
So, any other remaining thoughts for the week?
No, I'm looking forward to Psycho. I haven't seen it in a number of years.
Make sure to get Mom and Sarah to watch it with you.
Yes. I'm sure when it was first released and you didn't have any idea of what was going on, it had a lot more eerie impact than it does when you have some idea of the plot line.
I think it's hard for most people at this point to not know of that scene that is clearly referenced by a ton of things in pop culture. It's just that if you've never seen the film before, you don't know the context or what's going to happen. And then again, I would still say that probably, what, 3/4 of people probably go into it knowing that's going to happen at this point, which is unfortunate because it would be all the more shocking if you went into it clean.
And I'm sure we'll be bringing this up. This was loosely based on a serial killer slash cannibal named Ed Gein, who lived about 30 miles from where I live right now. His trial, after he was released and found mentally competent 15 years after the homicides, was conducted in the courthouse that when I was actually going to the courthouse on a regular basis, I used to practice in.
Well, before we get too far into next week's film, it is good to be back and back in the saddle a bit.
We're
I
back
th-
in the saddle again. Gene Autry.
It's going to be a little bit odd for maybe the first week or two, just coming back, trying to regain some of the footing, and I hope it's not evident in our performances, but it's good to try and get back into the regular routine as we kind of end the year. We've got a lot of exciting things coming up.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. And again, part of our thought process here is, you have that Friday or Saturday night and you're turning to your significant other and you want to watch a film and you don't know what to watch. Check our list.
Well, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else. Just us and the microphones. And those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Next week, we are continuing our month of Alfred Hitchcock with our last entry and our Halloween episode, Psycho, starring Anthony Perkins, Janet Leigh, Vera Miles, and Martin Balsam. You won't want to miss that one, so please watch ahead of the show by searching the Real Good app to find where it's streaming for you. That's REELGOD. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that you can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com, find us on Instagram @GMotePodcast, or find us on Twitter @GMotePodcast. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.